Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over this series and last, we've been talking to human rights academics and practitioners about research, impact, and advocacy in the struggle for human rights. I'm Todd Landman. In today's episode of the Rights Track, we're looking at the organization Human Rights Watch and how it collects and uses evidence to effect change. My guest is Iain Levine, who is Program Director at Human Rights Watch and oversees research and reporting. His expertise is in humanitarian crises, protection of civilians in conflict, and children's rights. He spent more than 10 years in Sudan and Mozambique working on humanitarian programs with a particular emphasis on the protection of children and other civilians. He's also worked as Amnesty International's representative at the United Nations and UNICEF's Chief of Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy. So welcome, Iain. It's a great pleasure to have you here on the Rights Track today.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So Human Rights Watch is a big organization. It has a global presence. It's well known around the world among human rights activists and practitioners and academics. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the work of the organization and how it's structured around the world.
I'd be delighted. So we were established now almost 40 years ago. We currently monitor and document human rights violations in around 90 countries around the world. So we have regional divisions covering Europe and Central Asia, Africa, Asia, Middle East, North Africa, the Americas, and so on, including a robust US program. But also over the years, as we have developed and deepened our country expertise and our ability to work at country level on human rights issues, we've also sought to develop what we call our thematic expertise, or expertise in particular kinds of human rights issues. So over the years, we've developed work on women's rights, children's rights, the rights of LGBT people, refugee rights, business and human rights, and the rights of people with disabilities, and so on. So we look to engage across the spectrum of human rights issues as well as geographically.
So that's great, because a lot of organizations just really focus on civil and political rights or economic and social rights, but you're really taking the full spectrum of human rights into account when you do your work. And you mentioned being a monitoring and documenting organization. So how do you go about doing that work? What are the sorts of things, the tools that you use to monitor and document what's happening in the world?
When we talk about our work, when we think about our model of activism, the three words that we use to describe what we do are investigate, expose, and change. And the theory of change, if you like, is that by carefully and credibly monitoring and documenting violations of human rights and exposing them to the world and to policymakers and diplomats and journalists and fellow activists through media and social media, that we can push for change. And in all our reporting, we're not only seeking to say what's going on in the world and whose human rights are being violated, how and why, but we're seeking to make clear, concrete, pragmatic, as well as principled policy recommendations for change, for bringing violations to an end, for bringing perpetrators to justice, and for ensuring that laws, policies, standards, and institutions are strengthened in order to more effectively protect human rights in a sustainable way. On the investigate side, the emphasis is on interviews with victims and witnesses and perpetrators wherever possible, but also backing that up with photographic evidence, the use of satellite imagery, study where relevant of statistics and data, consultations of court transcripts, morgue reports, hospital records, and so on, to help build up a complete and credible picture of what's been happening from a human rights perspective.
And so do you have any decision rules, moving from the investigation to the exposed side of things? When do you feel that it's safe to launch a report or to publish a finding where you feel that you have full confidence in the evidence you've collected and you say, right, we're going to push go on this and we're now going to expose these practices and raise awareness about what's happened in a particular situation?
So I would say there are a couple of factors that determine the timing of the publication of findings. I mean, the first and most important is that we have to be absolutely sure of the rigor of our findings and the credibility of the testimonies. And there we have a very detailed, intensive internal review process from the researcher, who is the frontline documenter, the person who has been out on the ground, meeting with victims and witnesses and talking to them and reviewing all the information. And they will go through a review process that goes to their supervisors, to our legal office and others in the organization to ensure that the story holds up, that we are absolutely confident that we have verified, that we have corroborated, and that all the testimony and the evidence stands up to criticism, because we obviously know that whatever government or other entity that we criticize, that they're going to come back and they're going to try and poke holes in our story, and we have to be absolutely sure. And we will take the time we need to make sure we've got that right. The second factor is timing the release of the information for the maximum possible impact so that we can hope to achieve the change. And that will depend on a whole series of political and other factors to pick the right moment to make as big an impact as we can and to push for the kind of change that we want to see.
That's fantastic. So I really like this checking and double checking and getting supervisors to check, etc., because human rights organizations can be so vulnerable to attack, and unless you have a robust evidence base and you're really confident in the sorts of things that you're saying, then you're wide open to a credibility problem, reputation problem, etc. So I guess you'd never be accused of fake news, right?
This is something that we have reflected on a lot in recent months. We live in an age of so-called alternative facts and fake news. And it's something that worries us a lot, in the sense that there seems to be declining respect for expertise and declining respect for objectivity and declining respect for facts. And as an organization whose impact is rooted in our ability to tell the stories and bring credibility to those findings, this is not an easy climate in which to operate. And we've talked a lot about how one does so. But ultimately, there's really no alternative but to double down on the facts and double down on the corroboration and the credibility of the findings.
Yes, and I think, you made reference to satellite imagery, for example, and it was interesting about the crowd size at the presidential inauguration. And here we had aerial photographs from both events, the Obama inauguration and the Trump inauguration, and people that do sort of crowd size estimates, talking about the assumptions behind their modeling, and so there was visual evidence, there was statistical evidence, that's doubling down on facts. And I think, the same thing with human rights. If you have satellite data that show you sort of mass grave sites, you then have forensic evidence that show you bodies and exhumations, you then have witness testimony and statistical estimations, all that can paint a very, very robust picture that allows you then to go into the public domain. But I'm curious, when you get to the expose function, then what's the strategy there? Because the world is bombarded with horrific stories about things happening around the world. So how do you cut through all of that? How do you get a presence and a salience in the world of ideas, in the world of human rights compassion fatigue, if you will?
It's a great question. It's something we worry about a lot. I've been with Human Rights Watch now for a little over 14 years, and so much has changed in the media and social media landscape to make the exposing a lot more complex and in many ways more difficult than it was. Although in some ways, I think the arrival of social media and our ability to make use of this also has expanded our toolbox dramatically. So we begin with the facts and the credibility of the facts, and obviously that's the sine qua non for everything we do. But on top of that, we have to bring a human dimension, a capacity to tell human stories that make sense of the facts and bring home to people in an emotional as well as intellectual way the import of what we're saying. There's a tremendous emphasis on visual imagery that goes along with the words to help tell the story in an effective way and in a short way. Not everybody has time to read a 50 or 60 page report, so we need to make sure that we can provide information in a more compressed way. And there's a tremendous emphasis on both the media but also increasingly social media to get our story out into the public domain in different languages. And of course, as an international organization, we have to think carefully and strategically about what languages we need to be telling the stories in order to reach those most in need. Now, one of our big advantages as an international NGO is that we've developed a tremendous social media following. Our institutional Human Rights Watch Twitter feed, to give an example, has 3.2 million followers. So every time we tweet out a press release, a report, or any kind of written product or visual product, there are 3.2 million people potentially who are exposed to that. And in addition to our institutional feed in English, we have institutional feeds in Russian, in Chinese, in Arabic, in French, in Spanish, in German, and Portuguese, and so on. So that gives us an opportunity to tell our stories beyond the English-speaking world and to mobilize people behind the stories we're telling and the change that we're pushing for.
And so do you do any analytics on your Twitter feed to work out who's opening, who's reading, who's sharing, so you kind of know the hit rate of your efforts? And, do you do any market segment analysis and look at your target markets in terms of the messaging and the length of things going out, the long reports, the short tweets, all that kind of stuff?
Yes. Every week, our digital director sends a weekly report around to all the program staff in the organization. So to me and my team, the directors, the researchers and advocates, and basically for every single thing we put out, he shows us how many people tweeted on the link or clicked on the link, how many people stayed there, how long they read the piece for. So it gives us a good sense of what material is reaching what audience. It doesn't answer all our questions. Obviously, for some pieces of work, you may not need 50,000 people to click onto it. It may be enough to have 50 if it's the right 50 people. And we don't always know with exactitude who they are, but we are becoming increasingly sophisticated and focused on doing that so that we can better assess how to reach the people we want to reach for the change we want to make.
That's great. So when you move from the exposed to the change part of your work, how do you know whether you've affected change or not? Because it's one thing to get all the stories out there, but do you have a way of sort of registering whether change has happened, and do you document change so that you close the feedback loop from outputs to impact, and then you know that people have changed their behaviors, or there's been some sort of major innovation as a result of the work that you do?
It's obviously a critical area of work. It's something that we are not as strong at the institutional level as we need to be and we want to be, and it's something that we're really working on to develop better mechanisms for ensuring that we learn across the institution from our ability to affect change. If you sit down with any of our researchers on a country, on women's rights issues, on children's rights issues, on refugee rights issues, and say, okay, what's been the impact and the change that you've seen as a result of the most recent piece of work you did, the most recent report you wrote, the most recent documentation you did, they will give you a very good sense of progress. Now, progress doesn't necessarily mean the achievement of the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal may be to pass a new law outlawing discrimination against a particular group, or it may be deploying a peacekeeping force to protect civilians in the conflict. But they will give you a very good sense of the progress, the trajectory that we're making. There's been a new coalition formed to work on this issue. Opposition MPs have tabled a bill in Parliament. There's a resolution upcoming at the UN Human Rights Council. So we try and monitor and track those developments to make sure that we are moving towards our ultimate goals and the recommendations we've made. And we're working to try and do a better job of promoting learning across the organization so that institutionally we can learn from different efforts, different techniques, different ways of promoting particular kinds of recommendations around new laws, around sanctions against those responsible for war crimes, or whatever it may be, to see how we can best promote change on a broad range of issues.
Thanks for that. That's a really good clarification about how we kind of document the change that we think we can have. So you mentioned in the beginning of our discussion that you have a kind of US-focused piece of work that you're doing. What are the sorts of things you're focusing on now, and the sort of, the Trump 100 days and the sorts of things that Human Rights Watch is worried about that are happening in the United States?
We've long had a US program way back to the early days of the organization, and it's a very important part of our work, both because there are many human rights issues to work on here in the US, obviously, both domestic human rights issues and concerns about the US's foreign policy being the most influential foreign policy in the world. It's also very important for us because we are based in New York City and we were founded in the US. The first question that we are often asked is, well, what are you working on the US and how are you criticizing the US before you come and criticize us here? So it's very important to be able to demonstrate that we're working on a range of issues across criminal justice, across immigration, Guantanamo Bay, the use of torture, surveillance, and a whole range of issues here in the US. Since the election of Donald Trump and the very strong anti-rights focus that he brings and much of the rhetoric he brought in the campaign, where he talked about reintroducing torture and sending more people to Guantanamo Bay and deporting more people and banning refugees and banning Muslims and so on, the emphasis on the US, has intensified, and the expectations of us to scrutinize and critique and criticize the actions of the new administration have intensified, and obviously we've looked to respond. To be clear, we are a non-partisan organization. We carried no water for the Democrats or against the Republicans. But obviously, when a government in any country in the world, but in this case the US, is enacting or suggesting that it wants to enact anti-rights legislation and anti-rights practice, we are obviously there to push and work on it. So we've been doing a lot of work on immigration issues, on efforts to block refugees from Muslim-majority countries, the imposition of the global gag rule, which has a huge impact on reproductive rights around the world, and much else.
Sure. And also part of the Trump approach is one that doubts climate change and wants big business to be deregulated with respect to the environment. So in the last few moments we have together today, and I wonder if you could just say a bit of the work that Human Rights Watch is now doing on human rights and the environment.
It's a very exciting time to be talking about human rights and the environment. Just literally this week, we're really formally kickstarting our new human rights and the environment program. We've been doing some work on the environment now for several years, with a particular focus in three areas: the impact of human rights, impact of climate change. And we did a very powerful piece of work, for example, from northwest Kenya, from the Turkana region, demonstrating how climate change was impacting on the indigenous populations there in terms of their access to water, to pasture land for their cattle, to food in general with declining levels in Lake Turkana, how it was impacting on health and their ability to access healthcare with changing disease patterns. So climate change clearly is going to be a huge issue for us going forward. We've also done quite a lot of work looking at environmental pollution and toxicity and how that impacts on the right to health and water and related rights, particularly focusing on issues such as access to information, right to participate, right to free assembly, right to free speech, and the difficulties that arise when rights are repressed and prevent people pushing back against the human impact of environmental toxicity. And the third area that we've worked on and want to intensify our work on is the protection of environmental activists. What several groups have been documenting, including Frontline Defenders and Global Witness and others, is that of all the human rights activists, the environmental, land rights and indigenous rights activists are probably those most under threat, most likely to be threatened and killed. And so working to protect safe spaces for environmental activism to take place, we see as a crucial human rights obligation, as well, of course, as being essential to the protection of the environment, because the environment's not going to be protected if those who seek to protect the environment are not given the space to be able to work within the parameters of free civil society, able to organize and protest and criticize and work with the free press and so on.
Yes, and equally, a lot of the areas where there's environmental degradation, you find a nexus with marginalized and vulnerable groups. So there's a kind of intersection, if you will, between those least well off in society and environmental degradation. So that the human rights element of all of that is brought to high relief. Was Human Rights Watch involved in the Dakota pipeline altercations between indigenous groups and the U.S. government?
Very little. We did a little bit of work there, but not nearly as much as others, partly because we just felt that our value added was not so great given other demands on our time at the time. But clearly that highlights and illustrates some of the most critical issues that we see both here in the US and many parts of the world, including the rights of affected populations to be able to demonstrate, to be able to organize, to be able to mobilize, to be able to protest and push back against environmental decisions made by governments that potentially have a huge impact on their economic well-being, their health, and other rights.
And so I'm really impressed with the sort of scale, the size, and the shape of Human Rights Watch. So in closing, could you just say something about the overall size? So how many staff are there? I mean, if you're documenting things in over 90 countries, how many people do you have working for the organization?
So we're about 435 people around the world, located in around 65 different locations. Traditionally, most of our staff were based in the US and Western Europe, but increasingly we have been placing staff around the world, both to document violations as researchers, but also our advocates and our communications colleagues and others are increasingly basing themselves around the world to be closer not only to the site of human rights violations, but to be closer to local activists, to local officials and diplomats and journalists and so on, so that we really, as an international human rights organization, seek to ensure that we have a genuinely international footprint. So it's a large group of people, 75 different nationalities, and in lots of different places around the world.
That's really great, and carrying out such important work. And it really gives our listeners an insight into how organizations work, the focus. It seems like you're very focused. You have strong, robust procedure for the investigate, strategies for exposure, and working out how you affect change. So I'm really delighted that you're able to share all that with us here. Very, very thorough exposition on everything that the organization is doing. So just leaves me at this moment then to thank you so much for being on this episode of The Rights Track, Iain.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. It's a hugely challenging time for the human rights movement at the moment. So I'm thrilled to have the chance to talk about how we at Human Rights Watch are trying to contribute to the aims of the broader movement.
This episode of The Rights Track was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 2 of the podcast is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. More information, including all the podcast episodes from Series 1 and accompanying show notes for each of our interviews, is available on our website at www.rightstrack.org.